Today we're going to look at the strongest units in the Krieg army list, at least in my opinion. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're back for another Korps of Krieg datasheet review, this time for none other than the trusty combat engineers, who quite possibly have the best shotguns in all of Warhammer 40k. In this video we'll take a look at their rules in 8th edition, any obvious combos and synergies, and how I would use them on the tabletop. In the background, the Korps engineers are specialist infantrymen well versed in the mechanisms of siege warfare, including plenty of operation underground, acting as sappers digging trenches and undermining enemy positions. Despite these highly specialised skills, they are still first and foremost soldiers, being equipped with the Lucius pattern semi-automatic shotgun and the long-burning acid gas grenade. These brutal armaments certainly give the combat engineers a sinister reputation even amongst the Greek forces, who are certainly pretty dour and resolute in the first place. One other interesting piece of equipment often employed by the combat engineers is the mole launcher. This unusual weapon fires a projectile that has a drill in its nose, and coupled with a power field emitter allows it to slice through rock very quickly, while one of the combat engineers guides the mole to its specific target, whether that be a building, vehicle or unlucky infantryman. The first thing that the foe might know of a squad of combat engineers is the fact that a mole launcher explodes through a fortified bulwark, causing a sudden catastrophic collapse. All very nice, let's see what these toys can do in-game. So here we have the datasheet for the Korps Combat Engineer Squad. Credit to Warhampedia for the very nice datasheet. So combat engineers are an elite's choice for a Korps of Krieg army. They come in squads of 5 at base, and you can include another 5 combat engineers, and typically when armed with their standard shotgun, they're 8 points ahead, putting a full squad at just 80 points. They've got a very similar profile to the Krieg Stormtroopers or the Tempestus Scions, with a movement of 6, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 3+, strength and toughness 3, 1 wound, 1 attack, leadership 6, and a relatively sturdy 4+ save. The squad is presided over by a Watchmaster who has 2 attacks and leadership 7. In addition to these shotguns, each engineer is additionally equipped with acid gas bombs and also frag and crack grenades. For me, the Krieg combat shotgun is the thing that really sets this unit above the rest. They have 2 types of ammunition, solid shot and carcass shot. Solid shot is your fairly standard shotgun profile, with 12-inch range, assault 2, strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Not too bad at chewing through light infantry, but it's the carcass shot that really shines. This is also 12-inch range and assault 2, but instead of having a strength profile, it just wounds anything that isn't a vehicle on the roll of a 2+. This is incredibly solid against all infantry types, but particularly brutal on big things like monsters or greater demons and things, who'd usually have their high toughness to protect them. Against vehicles, it wounds on 6s, so they're not going to be a ton of use against them, but the really good thing about these carcass shot is that they're damaged 2, meaning that they're absolutely going to chew through things like Primaris Marines and big tough monsters like there's no tomorrow. They do work in a similar way to plasma guns, unfortunately, which when you fire the carcass shot on the hit roll of 1, the bearer is slain, but frankly they have a decent chance of making their points back in one solid volley, and I still think that the carcass shot is in general going to be worth it. Those acid gas bombs are also highly interesting. They're a grenade, so typically only firing once per squad, unless you use the Grenadier's stratagem, which can allow the entire squad to throw a bomb in. These have the same rule as the carcass shot, wounding on 2s unless it's a vehicle, in which case you wound on 6s, so essentially is great against anything that's infantry or monster type. It also has AP-2 rather than the carcass shot shotgun's AP-0, and it's damage D3. If you need to choose through some exceptionally high save targets, say you were targeting a bunch of custody bikers for example, the acid gas bombs are going to do better than the Krieg combat shotguns with carcass shot. They're something around 50% better against 2+ save targets, provided they're not just 2 wound targets like Terminators or something, in which case the flat damage 2 of the shotgun does a little bit better. The acid gas bombs don't overheat and kill you on the roll of a 1 though, so that is another positive in their favour. This could quite possibly be the best unit in the Guard Armoury to use the Grenadier's stratagem on. In terms of war gear options, the Watchmaster has a few standard sergeant upgrades. They can replace their combat shotgun with one of the weapons from the Korps of Krieg ranged weapons list. As with the other Krieg options, the bolter and hotshot lasgun seem to be the best, but honestly I just don't think they compare very well with that godly shotgun, so I just keep the shotgun on him as well. He can take some weapons from the Korps of Krieg melee weapons list, so if you did want to give the squad a bit of a melee sting, you could give him a power fist or something, but sticking with the chainsword certainly isn't bad, an extra attack versus hordes certainly helps. Finally, the Watchmaster can take melter bombs, which are just 3 points, and to be honest that certainly could be a very reasonable choice, particularly as the squad's going to be operating at close range, so he's going to have far more chance to throw it than he normally would, particularly as you might use the Grenadiers stratagem. For 3 points I think it's not a bad idea, but it isn't certainly something that I'd absolutely say that you have to take. I would be happy to either take or leave it. As if the squad wasn't already great for the Grenadiers stratagem, one can also take a demo charge. This one's 5 points for a D6 grenade weapon with strength 8, AP-3 and damage D3. You can only use it once per battle, but with combining this, a melter bomb and a whole bunch of acid gas grenades, you're really going to put an enormous amount of hurt on the target if you can deliver the squad into the 6-inch range. So basically it could be very interesting if you are going to try and get the squad into grenade range and pop that Grenadiers stratagem. One combat engineer can take a Voxcaster. It's 5 points for some increased order range. Personally I'm not the biggest fan compared with just taking more officers, but your mileage might vary. 2 engineers can take a special weapon instead of their Krieg shotgun. That's a flamer, grenade launcher, melter gun or plasma gun. And the plasma gun and melter gun will unfortunately cost a bit more due to them being ballistic skill 3+. They're not the worst idea in the world, but again I just keep the shotgun as it's only 1 point and it's very good for that point. Finally, 2 engineers may form a Death Korps engineer weapons team with a heavy flamer or a mole launcher. We all know what heavy flamers do. Unfortunately I'm really not the biggest fan even on a close range squad like this. I'd rather just keep the engineers with their standard shotguns I'm afraid. The mole launcher is an interesting weapon, but I've got to admit it's a little bit underwhelming. It's an 18-point upgrade on the heavy weapons team, it's got 24-inch range and it doesn't need line of sight to its targets. It has a heavy D6, strength 5, AP-1 and damage 1 profile, so it's sort of like a heavy flamer that you need to hit for, and can hit any unit within 24 inches of the squad. Furthermore, if the weapon inflicts any unsaved wounds on the enemy unit, it can't advance in the next movement phase unless it can fly. For me this weapon's really interesting, but the price tag does let it down a bit. Against any targets that it can see, it's about the same damage output as a heavy bolter, and heavy bolters cost a lot less in the guard army. Now Ignore's line of sight is very handy, and messing with enemy movement could actually be genuinely useful in some games, but for me it's just a little bit situational and costs a bit too much. I think it's an interesting little gizmo. Maybe if it had damage 2 or something, I'd be a little bit more of a fan of taking it. In terms of special rules, they have the Death Korps Cult of Sacrifice, so won't be running away anytime soon from taking morale tests from shooting. Overall, the Death Korps Combat Engineer Squad is a murderous little close range unit that can stack a very scary amount of wounds on any non-vehicle target that they can reach. They're reasonably durable, have good ballistic skill, and still aren't the most expensive in the world at only 8 points per model. Let's have a talk about how we can get more out of them in game then. In terms of orders, it really is a shame that Death Korps don't have access to take aim. Rerolling those ones on those carcass shot shotguns will be absolutely great for both increasing damage output and also stopping them from dying. I guess we are in the Death Korps after all though. In absence of that, for ramping up damage we have Bring It Down, because everyone loves wounding on 2s, rerolling 1s to wound. Get Back in the Fight could also be particularly handy on these guys, as I'm sure operating up close and personal to the enemy, they're quite likely to get locked up in combat. In terms of other characters, one of the most interesting combos in my mind is Commissar Yarrick. He'll give you reroll 1s to hit and in close combat, so will nicely ramp up their damage output and stop those carcass shells killing them half as quickly. The Quartermaster Carter could also be interesting, with their Vitae Mortis giving the combat engineers a 6+ feel no pain type save, which certainly could keep them around on the battlefield just that little bit longer. In terms of making use of relics, the Dagger of Toussaint could be a really useful one for these guys. Giving this to a Death Korps officer and allowing them to outflank with access to an order could mean that they are absolutely guaranteed to put those shotguns to good use and get one nasty volley off to cripple an enemy troops unit hopefully. If you're not outflanking them, then the combat engineers are absolutely crying out for a transport to get them where they need to go. You could potentially have them riding as outriders in a centaur carrier, or perhaps take a bigger squad of them in the Death Korps of Krieg Storm Chimera. Very unfortunately, they can't make use of the Hades breaching drill as the current datasheet is locked to the veterans it comes with. Note to self, I've got to review the Hades breaching drill at some point. Although it doesn't exactly fit with the fluff at all, you could most certainly use a Valkyrie to transport them into battle, and it's actually probably one of the best things that you can possibly put in a Valkyrie. Being a murderous close-range anti-infantry shooting squad means that they're actually prime targets for the graph shoot insertion, and they're honestly one of the few units that really can make the Valkyrie worth its points in my opinion. Who would have thought that Death Korps seemed to do the drop force insertion thing slightly better than Elysians? You might have to take the Valkyries in a separate fly detachment possibly. but there's no reason that you can't do that. If you really want the combat engineers to ride there in style, then they could also potentially use a Gorgon heavy transporter, which is certainly very expensive, but really nothing does quite the same job at putting 30 toughness 8 wounds between you and the foe. You could fit 30 combat engineers in here with room to spare. In terms of stratagems, the Grenadier's stratagem is particularly tasty. Those acid gas bombs are really potent, and you might have the potential of lobbing in melter bombs or a demo charge if you've equipped the squad that way. Unless you are looking to throw in a melter bomb and demolition charge though, then I would weigh it up against just firing all the shotguns, which are very powerful. In general, against 3+ save targets, the shotguns are pretty much just as good, although of course you do overheat, so I'd save Grenadiers for either when you're fighting 2+ armour, or if you've brought fancy grenades along. Other than this, Vengeance Vicadia is always great. 4 rerolls to hit and wound would basically mean that you're pretty much guaranteed stacking 17 wounds at damage 2 on any non-vehicle unit, which is just crazy. I'd also strongly consider take cover on these guys, as going from that 4+ save to a 3+ save, and potentially a 2+ if you have cover yourself, could actually make these guys very surprisingly hard to shift in a pinch. So how would I use combat engineers myself in a competitive game of 40k then? Firstly, I think it would be an absolutely viable option to just run them with absolutely nothing besides the base shotguns in a squad for 80 points. The shotgun's the best thing about the unit, and if you don't want to complicate their priorities, then just having them as a unit with brutal close range damage output versus infantry and monsters is certainly a good way to go. To be honest, the only upgrades that really do tempt me on this squad are the Melter Bomb and Demo Charge. They'd only cost 8 points for the 2 of them, and could give the squad a really nasty surprise sting in the tail if they do get close to tanks. If you use the Grenadier's stratagem, they could put some surprise hurt on a vehicle, particularly if you're thinking about throwing some crack grenades instead of acid bombs. I'd honestly be quite happy to be flexible as to the squad size. Anything from 5 to 10 is fine. It doesn't really matter too much with morale, seeing as Cult of Sacrifice really keeps you around a bit better. My instincts would tell me to err on the side of larger squads for a bit more staying power exactly where you want it to be, and more efficiency with stratagems and things. In general, if I was using engineers, I'd probably want a way to get them into combat, and we mentioned the various options they have for transport already. It's a bit unfortunate that the Storm Chimeras are so much more expensive than standard ones, otherwise that'd be the way I'd be tempted to go, and it still might be one of the best. There's nothing wrong with the cheap nuisance centaurs though. As I said, Valkyries aren't very fluffy, but a really good way to get them exactly where they need to be straight away. So you can have all of that nasty damage output straight from turn 1, and running them in a massive Gorgon could also be a lot of fun as well. We also mentioned the Dagger of Tusark, and that's another solid way to fill them along with an officer. Basically, in general, I'd want them to have some sort of protection until they get to the front line, so you can guarantee that they can unleash those very potent weapons without them just getting blown away from the other side of the board. At 8 points per model, they're just really not all that tough compared with our standard guard infantry lines, even with carapace armour. In terms of support, if you could get him to support multiple characters, then Yarrick really isn't such a bad idea whatsoever. Their upfront nature might mean that he actually gets to use his slightly fighty stat line as well. Basically, in-game, I'd use whichever one of these delivery mechanisms suits your choice, and hopefully that should get you within 12 inches to unleash your first volley of shotgun fire. These are a unit that aren't multi-purpose, they absolutely need to be going after non-vehicle targets, which makes them a slightly more nuanced tool compared with a lot of our options in 40k. So your main challenge is going to be trying to make them line up with enemy infantry on the other side of the board. I'd really think about, in deployment, how you're best going to achieve that, as to where you position either your transports or squads in reserve, or if you're starting them on the table and putting them out of line of sight or something. After unleashing the shotgun fire, there's a very good chance they're highly exposed on the front line and might well be dying next turn. This means that you really should consider if charging is worth it. I wouldn't charge into anything that's just going to kill you, but if you could tie up some enemy gunline elements, or just get into a fist fight with a bunch of infantry, that might well be far better than just letting the opponent gun you down with trivial firepower next turn. It's particularly better with this strategy, so hopefully your next turn, provided they haven't been wiped out, they can just fall back and unleash another round with those potent shotguns. If charging isn't an option or isn't desirable, I'd certainly try and keep them in cover while they're unleashing their shotgun blast, and this could help you decide where you get them out of your transport, or where you outflank them onto or something. Having 3-up armor saves that can become 2-up armor saves with take cover is really quite a decent thing, and even if it doesn't save them from being gunned down, at least your opponent will have to waste a whole load more guns in trying to make that happen. I think in the vast majority of games they'll be decent frontline infantry and have solid targets to be able to take out, and in some games if they do manage to line up those shotguns on a really tough enemy target, something like a greater demon or something like that, they could well make a very meaningful, very drastic swing in the game and really surprise your opponent when your shotguns take down something that's many times their size. Overall, I really like the engineer squad, and I think they're probably the most competitive unit that the Death Korps of Krieg have to offer. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, including any real-world experience that you've had with the Death Korps combat engineers. It's certainly good to be able to talk with a bit more of a positive note about Krieg units, and it's nice that they've got something that's decently strong. If you've enjoyed the review, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Death Korps of Krieg coming down the line. And if you'd like to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon page. It takes quite a while to make all of these YouTube videos, so if you would like to see them keep coming, then any support is absolutely greatly appreciated. As always, a massive thank you to my Patreons who make this channel possible. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.